A word of warning or hope at the outset. What you're about to see, I promise, will make sense by the end, even if it takes a while to get there. How's that for an introduction to the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament, the last book in Christian Bibles? How's that for a way to introduce a book that can be ominous and foreboding and confusing and frustrated and also deeply hopeful? I promise in the end, there will be something that makes sense, even if it takes us a little bit to get there. That's honestly the vision I want to offer you here in these coming 6 weeks. We're going to invite you to join us, whether by video only or also joining us for in-person discussion and study over 6 weeks in a series that we're calling Lamb Power, to take a look at what the book of Revelation is all about and how to find good news in the midst of what it can otherwise be confusing detail and complicated imagery. I promise. Stay with us, be a part of the conversation. It's going to make sense. Things will come together by the end, and there is a word of good news to be heard. But I'm going to ask as we get started that you give me the benefit of the doubt, because the place that I'm going to ask us to start might not seem very religious, very biblical at all. Trust me, there's a method to the madness. I want to start actually with something that frustrates me and feels cliche, but I wish it weren't so. I'm going to start with this. You've probably seen this sign before: keep calm and carry on. You might well know some of the history behind this, the imagery and the symbolism behind it. You might know this kind of a poster emerged in the late 1930s and ran through the 40s in World War II in Great Britain as part of a campaign from the Ministry of Information to keep people cheerful and carrying on, as the poster suggests, in the midst of the threat of war and chaos and the fear that the world might be pulled into another world war. Hopefully, you've seen this before. And my guess is you've seen it not just in its original form, but in all sorts of variations. That's the part, honestly, that frustrates me, is that something that had a cool original meaning and a story behind it has been spun out in a million different directions, so that the original has kind of lost a lot of its power and potency. And maybe even a lot of folks don't know the original story behind keep calm and carry on. So a quick survey of the internet reveals all sorts of variations, from keep calm and love horses, which is a fine thing to do, but sort of just completely takes the idea of keep calm and just, I'm changing the color, I'm changing the logo, now there's a horse on top. It's basically become a meme. Anybody can put anything they like and put keep calm in front of it just to keep the joke going. And that's it. It becomes just a joke. So that you can also find this delightful variation: keep calm and eat chocolate, with a cupcake instead of a crown on top. Keep calm and carry a gun, which I think kind of misses the entire point of the original. And keep calm and grab the seam ripper. And then another kind of honest but disappointing: now panic and freak out. Borrowing the same imagery but communicating the exact opposite message. Now's the time to freak out. To see any or all of these has a way of reducing the original to being just the first in a line of variations that are a joke now. But I really kind of like the story and the origin of this and the symbolism in the original. In 1939, as the world braced for what it feared was being plunged into a new war and the Nazi war machine threatening to now envelop all of Europe and pull the whole world into another worldwide conflict, you found publishers in Great Britain with this simple message, and it sort of embodied the British spirit, right? If there's a cliche about the British spirit, is you keep a stiff upper lip and you carry on, right? You just keep muddling through. Well, that sort of put it really simply. What are we British people good at doing? How will we handle conflict? We will simply carry on. And the symbolism is important too. The crown on the top was sort of meant to be a reminder of, okay, we are a part of one of the longest standing, most stable forms of government. We've had our monarchy for literally centuries. We've endured through not only World War I, but through 100 Years' War and countless other wars with other nations and with ourselves. We've endured, so we're going to get through this. Your job is keep calm and carry on. It was grounded in something. It's okay. We're going to get through this. And the message gave clarity. The other thing I really kind of like or think about this message from the original Keep Calm and Carry On was that it sort of implied, okay, if there's a war, if Hitler and the Nazi Party tries to envelop the world in a war, okay, we're not asking you ordinary British citizens to go fight off that war by yourself right now. Your job, you at home right now, your job is to keep your wits about you. If there's other things you're called upon to do, if there's other ways you can be a part of fighting the Nazis or resisting or whatever, we'll tell you. But right now, the thing you can do is not panic. Keep on with life, okay? We're going to get through that. That was the message. And it's one that both comforted people who were kind of on the edge of freaking out, but also called for kind of vigilance of things are tense, things are important. So keep watching, keep your eyes open. When you're calm, you can be mindful of your circumstances. You can be paying attention to what the need is. And yeah, then there came a time when folks in towns and cities are supposed to turn off their lights at dark so that they could avoid attracting attention from the German Luftwaffe and the airplanes that would spot them at night. Or eventually, people were called to enlist, or they would gather supplies, or they would gather scrap metal, or in the United States, we made victory gardens, that kind of a thing. But it began with, we're not asking any one person to single-handedly go save the world or fight off Adolf Hitler. We're calling you right now. Your job in the midst of this is keep calm and carry on. Be true to the spirit of who we are as a people, trusting there's a power greater than just you at work. That was all communicated in, man, what, 5 words. Keep calm, carry on, and a crown to remind you this isn't all up to you. We're part of something bigger and more stable. I want to suggest that there's real richness and a lot of messaging, a lot of really intelligent, thoughtful messaging that worked exactly with the audience it was aimed for and spoke a clear message that was helpful in a time when people wanted to lose their heads and panic or just have no idea what to do. And it's kind of sad to see how easily this message has gotten turned into all sorts of silly variations, now panic and freak out, to the seam ripper to keep calm and carry a gun or eat chocolate. None of those are helpful, and those reduce this original message to just a joke or a tired meme on the internet. I want to suggest we do the same thing with the book of Revelation. That there is a very particular message grounded in the history out of which it arose, that certainly speaks to you and me in our context now 2,000 odd years later, but that we are setting ourselves up for misunderstanding it and turning it into just some sort of like goofy meme or caricature if we don't pay attention to what was originally being said in the original context. If you know why there's a crown on top in the original, and you know why this is the wording and this was the messaging and what was the context, this makes a lot more sense. This is how to keep ordinary public people from becoming a mob. This is what keeps people functioning through their day until there's a next step for what to do. This encourages people just to indulge in junk food, and this is not helpful at all. But Keep Calm and Carry On has a message rooted in an original set of circumstances. And so now, you or I might find this to be helpful reassurance from time to time, even though we don't live in pre-World War II Great Britain, and Americans don't have a crown or a monarchy to be find our comfort in. There are other sources for our comfort, but we can have a similar mindset. We can learn something or take comfort or direction from a poster like this, even though we live in a different time and setting. So, I want to suggest we approach the book of Revelation with the same kind of care that it takes. It doesn't take a lot, but it takes the intentionality. The same way we would apply and ask, what's the story behind this? And why was this the messaging? And why was this important to be said in this time and place? And what might it mean for us in our circumstances that we have the same kind of approach as we approach the book of Revelation? It's easy to misunderstand or to just grab symbols and assume we know what they mean. It takes a little more work to explore a little more deeply what's going on. So knowing our history is going to be crucial. And taking a look at the broad brushstrokes of what this beast is, this book, what the book itself, and what kind of strange critter it is, that's helpful too. We know how to read other kinds of literature. Sometimes Christians make the bad mistake of not even using the same common sense you would use when approaching a cookbook or a novel or a newspaper report. We don't bring that kind of intelligence and critical thinking to reading the Bible. So the same way that if you are looking at a story with lots of big illustrations and few words on a page, this is a children's book, this is going to present information differently than, say, a college textbook. Or a cookbook is how to make something, not a report of necessarily something that happened, nor is it a prediction of what your cake will look like. It's how to make a cake, and if you do this well enough, you'll get your cake to look like the one in the recipe. We know how to read different kinds of literature in our world, and the book of Revelation is a kind of literature. In fact, it's several kinds that are glommed together. The book of Revelation has a large majority of it written in a style called apocalyptic literature, which to us is not very frequently used. That's not a style of literature we use, but it shows up a couple of places in the Bible itself. In the book of Daniel, there are apocalyptic sections in the Gospel according to Matthew, and then Mark and Luke and Matthew and Luke kind of riff on it. And then in the book of Revelation itself, it's sometimes called the Apocalypse itself. One thing that's difficult about apocalyptic literature is it is intentionally symbolic in lots of ways. And symbols only work if people who are reading it understand what the meaning of a symbol is. You have to know when you see this poster, not only that this is supposed to be a crown, but it's indicative of a particular crown. This is the Royal British Crown. It's symbolic of the British monarchy, and it means something positive in its original context. People who saw this were supposed to feel, I feel comforted and supported that there's a strong, stable monarchy governing things, and they won't get things out of hand. Other cultures might look at a crown and feel like, we don't want to have a monarch. In the United States, we talk about a democracy. We talk about having federal representatives and that kind of thing. That this symbol doesn't mean quite the same thing. It's important to take a look at what symbols mean in their original context, and then to make the move, what might this mean in our time and our place? Apocalyptic literature is grounded in using symbolism, and not just for illustration purposes, but each symbol can often be loaded with meaning, and it's worth unpacking. What do these symbols mean? Part of why symbolic representation is used in apocalyptic literature is that apocalyptic literature is often resistance literature, underground literature. It's messages for people who are under constant threat, who can't say things in overt ways, but have to find kind of backhanded, clever ways to make a reference to what they're trying to say in a way that won't get them directly in trouble, but will allow the message to be passed along. Almost like the storytelling about how the songs and spirituals of enslaved black people in the United States would use symbolism and imagery. So following the drinking gourd is a way of talking about the Big Dipper in the sky. If you go ahead and give away the plan of you can find your way to freedom by following these stars in the sky, that's a great way to get caught. But if there's coded language, people can get what the message is. Apocalyptic literature is rife with symbolic imagery and representation. And instead of just me thinking, I want to imagine that a crown means this, or an eagle means this, or a lamb means this, it's worth exploring. And knowing that for its original hearers, those were a lot clearer. And the writers assumed that their readers would understand those connections. If we don't immediately get it, we need to do the homework so that we don't turn keep calm and carry on into get the seam ripper or your sewing machine. You need to know what the symbol means. Also important about apocalyptic literature is that it's a way of taking multiple images that maybe are best understood visually into written words. In our culture, we can do video representation, we can do artwork, and you can send a copy of an image around the world. In the first century, you had to write things in words. So a description of something that you've seen visually is going to be hard to represent and hard to exactly know what somebody else had in mind. We're dealing with something that is the visual imagery of almost like a dream or a movie or that kind of image that's now been put into written form. The book of Revelation also isn't just apocalyptic, but there's a group of 7 letters at the beginning of it that sure have the feel of actual letters to actual real historical congregations in real places. They are open letters, which is to say they're public, that what they're said isn't secret, but what's written in them is for other people to be aware of as well. Kind of like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, which was written with a specific context and audience in mind, but knowing that by publishing it widely, others would see what he had to say. The book of Revelation starts like that with 7 open letters and then moves into this very heavily symbolic apocalyptic section. And knowing that the context for the early church was living in this sort of underground situation of being seen as a threat by the empire and seen as a threat to most respectable people in the wider culture, that makes a difference for how we understand how the story goes, what's happening, and even who to root for. In, say, 1930s Britain, you wanted the crown to win. You wanted the powers that be to stay stable and keep us safe. That's how that story went. But in the book of Revelation, the powers that be are the brutal and cruel Roman Empire that was putting to death followers of Jesus, and even before the rise of Christianity, it was awfully cruel and brutal and oppressive to people that it conquered. To read the book of Revelation is to have an inversion of who we should be rooting for. Instead of rooting for the powers that be to continue on, we're sort of rooting for the end of the powers that be and the beginning of a new creation under God's reign and God's rule. And once you get that key, that this is not about keeping things stable the way they are, but about overturning what it looks like, what the wider world thinks about how things work, and bringing about God's upside-down version, that changes things. So the book of Revelation has this opening scene that sort of sets the table, introduces us to the writer, John, who is in exile, sort of like Dr. King in the Birmingham jail, and then 7 letters, and then we move to a throne room scene that sort of says, here's what the world's story looks like from God's vantage point. I know that from the world's vantage point, it looks like Rome calls the shots, and might makes right, and having more weapons and cruelty are strength. No, from God's vantage point, things look very different. And it turns out God really is in charge, and it turns out God really does know how the story is going to work out, and it turns out God's able to take the mess that we've made and turn something good out of it. That central major section of the book of Revelation has repeated sort of cycles to it. 7 seals on a scroll, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of judgment, where sort of the same thing happens in a cycle, and then, okay, now we're going to tell that story with a slightly different set of images, and then a slightly different way. It's not meant to be one narrative from point A to point B to point C, but I'm going to give you a set of images. Once you understand that, I'm going to tell it to you in a slightly different way so that you can remember it. Because again, we're talking about trying to take images and visuals and ideas into the written word. How do you communicate that? Well, in an oral culture, through repetition. So as we discover in the book of Revelation, there's not just sort of a chronology of this and then this and then this and then this and then this in time, as though the book of Revelation is predicting a chain of events that happens in 1 year and then moving through time to the end, but almost more like, all right, I'm going to give you a set of ideas. All right, I'm going to let you think on that, and now I'm going to present it to you in another way so that maybe you get the idea and need it again. Okay, here's yet a third way. That kind of almost cyclical spiral sort of idea where the same images sort of are turned over and presented in a new way, and then yet again, we're not used to that. We're used to watching TV shows where there's a plot in the beginning and the middle and end, and that's it. But in a culture that doesn't have the ability to go back and rewind, in a culture that can't binge watch or repeat watch something, in a culture that everybody isn't literate and can't go back and reread, you need to be able to communicate in ways that help the messages, the ideas to stick, and repetition is a piece of that. So the middle piece of the book of Revelation has a way of talking about, here's how things look from God's vantage point, and telling it over and over and over, for the sake of driving the idea home. There's God's way, there's the empire's way. God in the end is going to win, even though it sure looks like Rome is in charge right now. Then, a final culminating judgment of all the powers that are arrayed against God. God is victorious, and yet, at no point does God direct the people who are followers of Jesus to be soldiers in some kind of war. Interestingly enough, sort of like this keep calm and carry on, there is this assumption, if there's a war to be fought, okay, the army's going to take care of that. There are people who are going to actually fight off Nazis. Your job right now is keep your head, keep your wits about you, and trust. You're not called to single-handedly go off and go fighting Hitler one-on-one. Your job right now, your place in this is to trust. And when there's more specific details for what you're supposed to do, okay, we'll give it to you. But broad brushstrokes, you're supposed to carry on. Don't let them have victory over us by making us go into a panic when we don't need to. That kind of thing. The book of Revelation has that same idea. It's God who wins the victory. At no point does God say to early Christians, all right, you guys got to take up weapons because we got to fight off Rome on our own. It's about God's way of accomplishing victory. In fact, the real surprise in the book of Revelation is to discover God's already won a victory through Jesus, and that victory looks to the world like loss. It looks like crucifixion, and resurrection. It looks like, well, the central image, a lamb who's been slain, who is yet alive. The central image, in other words, of the book of Revelation is not a call to arms where we're supposed to go storm the Capitol in Rome and overthrow Caesar, but to trust. From God's vantage point, Caesar's destruction has already begun. Our calling is how do we carry on in the meantime, trusting God's going to work out that final victory. But it's not up to us to go make God win. Our calling is to be faithful witnesses to the way of Jesus in the meantime. That central idea of being a faithful witness in the meantime to the way of Jesus, that makes a whole lot of sense of what happens in the book of Revelation. And after that final sort of vindication, when God finally sets all things right and the powers of evil, everything that's made people afraid or fearful, all the violence and cruelty and rottenness, not just of Rome, but of the way of empire throughout history, once that's been dealt with, then new creation. In other words, there's the promise of a new beginning, of setting things right. So the last word isn't judgment, isn't smashing things, it's setting things right. To say no to all the powers of evil that are out there. The same way this was about saying no to Nazism and saying no to the German Reich, but also to trust there would be new creation that came through on the other side of it. That's how the book of Revelation works in big, big, big picture ways, right? Introduction of John, sort of the open letters, the revealing of what things look like from God's vantage point, the promise of a final setting of things right, of what we sometimes call judgment, but not in a way to make us afraid, more to say, all the powers that are working evil in the world, they'll be put in their place. Don't you worry. And then the promise of new creation. That's where things are headed. That by the end of the story, things are set right at last. That injustice doesn't get the last word. That violence doesn't get the last word. That cruelty or hunger or hate or death itself doesn't get the last word. So as we take a look at the book of Revelation in the coming weeks, there's going to be 4 big questions we're going to keep coming back to that I hope help make sense of individual passages when we take a look at them in light of these 4 big questions. Number 1, who gets my allegiance? The writer of the book of Revelation, John of Patmos, is sometimes pretty stark. There's 2 sides. You don't get to sit on the fence. It's either am I going to be a part of the way of God, which we know through the person of Jesus, or am I going to be a part of the way of empires? And if I have to pick, the empire is going to keep trying to pull me in to give my allegiance to Caesar or to the whatever the latest empire of the day is, or am I going to be somebody who follows the way of Jesus? Who gets my allegiance? And then 2, who's really Lord? That's related, right? Who's really in charge and who wins the victory in the end? Caesar went around in the first century declaring not only Caesar is Lord, but that Rome's victory and reign would last forever. Over against that, the book of Revelation says, no, Caesars come and go, empires come and go. God is the one whose victory is achieved forever, and Jesus is the one who is Lord. So who gets my allegiance? Who really is Lord? Who really is victorious? And then how is that victory won? Rome has a way of telling the story of how it wins its victories. It marches its armies in, and it crushes you, it destroys you, it conquers you, and then it takes your stuff and uses it to make more weapons to go conquer the next people. The story of the book of Revelation says, nope, not how victory is won, not how God wins a victory in any case, and eventually that ends up eating itself like a snake eating its own tail. Eventually, that crumbles under its own weight. God's way of achieving victory that's already been accomplished is through death and resurrection, through a cross and suffering love centered in this image of a lamb, Jesus, the lamb who's slain and is alive again. So who gets my allegiance? Who's Lord? Who really wins? How is that victory really won? And then how do I live now in light of that victory and that allegiance and that promised future? Sort of like this poster used to do. Keep calm and carry on made sense if it was grounded in the promise. And you're not alone in this. There's a long-standing, very stable monarchy that's going to work on making sure we're all safe, we're all okay, it's going to be all right. Your job is continue with your life and don't freak out, don't lose your mind, it's going to be okay. That's the heart of this message. So it was a how do I live? Okay, I'm going to keep myself calm and grounded. We're going to be okay. We're going to get through this because I trust the one who's making the promise. Now, you can decide whether or not the British monarchy was worth giving your allegiance or your trust or your way of mind, your way of life to. But the book of Revelation makes a similar claim. For people who dare to believe that God truly has already won the victory in the cross and resurrection of Jesus, then it's possible for us to live differently without losing our minds in the midst of a world where there sure is an awful lot of unrest and violence and rottenness and evil in the world. Not by succumbing or giving our allegiance to the ways of empire that keep, new packaging, new letterhead, but same old rottenness, but by being faithful witnesses to the way of Jesus. That's refreshing good news. The way we get to that is to pay attention to what's going on as John tells the story, as John gives us these images in the book of Revelation itself. But the way we get there is that paying attention to what's going on historically, what's going on in the way he talks, the symbols he uses, and then from there, what does that mean for our lives? In the rest of our series, we're going to be doing some more in-depth looks at each of these parts of the book of Revelation. The book itself is so monstrously long and complicated. We're not going to be doing every verse getting an hour-long reflection or sermon or commentary on it. But hopefully, as we take a look at case studies throughout the book, we'll trace that motion. We won't just be stuck in the first century. What did this mean a long time ago? But we're able to move to what does this mean for me and my life here and now, right where I am. We hope you can join us for future sessions here of Land Power, gathering Tuesdays at New Life at 7 o'clock in person and with weekly videos like this. Christ peace.